Good afternoon, and welcome to today's episode of Scala's Love of Learning Live. This webinar series began during COVID as a way to bring together some of the scholars around the country who address questions at the heart of the mission of Scala Foundation, a nonprofit that I started about 4 years ago, dedicated to promoting models of education that form the person, mind, body, and soul in a holistic manner. Today, I'm extremely pleased to be hosting Professor William Damon of Stanford University. Before I give him a formal introduction, I just want to say a few words about how this webinar will proceed. The webinar is structured as first a dialogue between myself and Professor Damon. The audience will be able to ask questions on the Q&A button, and we will address those questions at the end of our discussion after about 45 minutes. If you like, right now, you may use the chat button just to say your name and where you're logging in from. We have a range of people who sign up for these webinars, from parents, educators, people in think tanks, other professors, and it's always great to see the names and interests or affiliations or just geographical locations of the people with us today. As I mentioned, I started Scala about 4 years ago. I'm also a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, and I'm really passionate about bringing together research and practitioners, people who care about bringing together the best philosophy of the human person with the best educational practices that promote learning as well as holistic human development. In its first few years, Scala has sponsored several conferences here in Princeton, as well as a number of dinner seminars with faculty and reading groups with faculty and students. Scala's keynote or special program has been an intensive summer program that we have hosted the past 3 summers for students from all over the country to study in depth the foundational questions in educational philosophy and think through how to apply ancient wisdom and recent research on education to a diversity of contexts. This summer, in 2020, Scala will be partnering with the Pepperdine School of Public Policy, who is also a co-sponsor of today's event, to bring Scala's core themes to a summer course for summer scholars in DC. So actually, in the month of July 2020, I will be teaching Scala's foundational texts with the Pepperdine School of Public Policy and a fantastic group of 20 new students who are passionate about these questions and want to take them into a variety of research and political and schooling contexts. Scala's activities have been so successful and drawn people from so many different parts of the country to its events that COVID was a great time to use the internet to start this webinar series. This is now the 7th webinar Scala has done in the past few months. If you missed any of our prior dialogues with people such as Elizabeth Corey from Baylor and Robert George from Princeton University, Roosevelt Montas from Columbia, and others, please do visit Scala's YouTube channel where you can find all the videos, as well as this video. It'll be posted there as soon as we're done, and highlight clips from each of those videos. Now, I would like to welcome our special guest today, Professor William Damon of Stanford University. He is a professor in the Graduate School of Education, and he is also the director of Stanford Center for Research on Adolescence, which is another co-sponsor of today's event. I do encourage you to visit Professor Damon's website at Stanford, where you will find links to his books and his research articles, as well as many articles he has written in national publications that you can access online from anywhere. I also really encourage you to visit the website of the Stanford Center on Adolescence to see the fantastic research that they do to put this knowledge into the hands of the general public, parents and educators, and anybody who cares about youth development. Please also do visit the website of our co-sponsor today, the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. I'm extremely grateful to Pete Peterson, the Dean of the Pepperdine School of Public Policy, for co-sponsoring these events. Now, I always like to start off with a bit of an autobiographical question about your own education. So, Bill, I'm curious if you could just tell us a little bit about your own educational experiences. Where did you study as a youth, as a young man? Where did you do your higher education? And what about your own educational experiences led you to develop such a rich research agenda, which I would summarize as being focused on the moral development of the person from youth through maturity, and how do you bring ancient wisdom on morality in conjunction with recent research on the moral nature of the human person and moral behavior, and how do you apply those research insights and deep philosophical insights into education? So what is your educational background, and how did you come to formulate this fantastically interesting research agenda?
Well, that's a big question. I hope I can do a little self-reflection. The professional part of my education was pretty traditional. I went to college and graduate school. I went to Harvard and studied social psychology there, and the University of California at Berkeley, where I studied developmental psychology. So I had very good academic training in those disciplines. But I'll tell you just a couple of stories about less formal parts of my education that I think played a big role in exactly what you're asking, which is why I got interested in the kinds of moral and social processes that you mentioned, and eventually led to my studies of purpose and moral commitment. I'll tell you one very early and one very late in my education. The early one was in the ninth grade, and I was not a very motivated student in ninth grade. I grew up in a kind of unintellectual part of the country, never thought much use in school, and basically was a lazy, uninvolved student. But I did get involved in one thing that interested me, which was my school newspaper. And I covered sports, which I loved at the time, and I was too young to make any of the sports teams, so this was my way of hanging around the teams. And one of my early stories for the newspaper was a game that they assigned me to with our junior varsity soccer team. This was a very low status sports event because I was a very incompetent writer. And so they assigned me to something that nobody would be interested in at all. And our junior varsity played a group of Hungarian kids that had formed, it was an immigrant group that had formed a little get-together team. And they played much better than our junior varsity because they came from Europe and nobody was playing soccer in the US at the time. And that was a pretty interesting game. But the part that interested me most was when I hung around after the game and spoke to the kids from the Hungarian team. And these young people were so thrilled about being in America. They had recently come over, escaping the revolution and communism and all of that. And they had nothing. Their parents had packed them sandwiches, I'll never forget, of green pepper and bacon fat sandwiches. And I was feeling sorry for these kids, but they were so happy and thrilled. And they talked about what pleasure it was to be in America and in a free society and have opportunity. And that was the story I wrote for the school newspaper, not the story about the game. And I discovered that my friends read the story and were really interested in it. I had found out something new that I knew nothing about either, about this process of immigration and even the sense of that I'd never appreciated about the special parts of growing up in America. And I discovered that this was something that people would read and enjoy and learn from. And that was how the seeds of my academic interests were planted. I then figured out, well, you know what? I'm going to learn how to be a good writer. I'm going to learn how to do research. That was the first time I had done research and written about it for other people. And I really traced my own purpose in life back to that experience of writing a school newspaper. It wasn't a classroom thing, it wasn't a teacher, it was really that extracurricular activity that was educative for me and motivated me to then take my classroom work seriously. So that's an early story. Late, after I was already doing psychological research and working in developmental psychology, and I was, I think at this point, a professor at Clark University in Massachusetts, or maybe I was at Brown at the time. I got involved in a project with my wife, Ann Colby, on studying American moral exemplars. And I'll never forget the time I spent with one of them. These were people that were dedicated, had dedicated decades of their life to things like charity or world peace or environmental causes. And the woman that I spent a weekend with, who was just amazing to me, was a woman named Susie Valadez, living in El Paso, Texas. And she would cross the border every day to Juarez to work with the children and families who were living around a garbage dump in Juarez, in Juarez. And she would do missionary work. She would build schools and hospitals and raise money for them. And the kids loved her. They would gather around her. And I spent maybe 2 or 3 14-hour days with this woman who at the time was in her 70s. I was in my late 30s, I think. And she exhausted me, totally wore me out, was full of joy and spirit. And I just, I think at that time, and she was a woman of deep faith. She only had an 8th grade education herself, but had learned how to do everything from building hospitals and schools to raising money. She was amazing and really taught me something about doing good work in the world and commitment. She was so dedicated that at that time I really became committed myself to trying to understand how people can be so dedicated and see through all the hardships and persevere, because you don't always get good results with that kind of work either. So you have to be able to put up with disappointment and frustration and be patient. She had done this work for 40 years. So that was very inspiring to me, and that was my later life educative experience.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I will say that this actually leads into the 2 stories you told about your being a young man, not being a motivated high school student. It's very humble of you to admit that, given that you're now a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and have published so many things. But that in some ways you found what I've heard you yourself call your spark in writing for the high school newspaper, but writing not about the soccer match, writing about these young people from Hungary, their appreciation of the United States system. And also your story about the woman who would cross the border every day to go work in Mexico reminds me of the long line of research you've done on moral exemplars. It sounds like she was a moral exemplar for you, somebody who led a life worth living and knew how to lead other people in that. And I will just share, and then I would like to lead into this, that I think what really made me appreciate the education I had was my first trip to Latin America. It was 1994. Although I grew up with a Spanish-speaking mother, my mother came to the United States when she was 20 years old, married my father, who she met at Catholic U, and she beat him in chess. Um, and really, taught me to value education. And although my mother always told me that there were educational opportunities in the US that she didn't have in Cuba, that doesn't really sink in as much as when I made my first trip to Latin America and I realized how many people didn't have public education, didn't have the access at all to go beyond 8th grade education. And then, a few years later, living and working in Latin America and traveling around to war-torn areas where people are in one-room schoolhouses with dirt, going to Haiti and learning Haitian Creole and working with Haitian children and singing in their schools and seeing that there are these, but at the same time as I noticed the material deprivation, I also experienced a kind of joy and a deep sense of purpose and a commitment in the leaders of these communities. And I realized that these moral exemplars, as you call them, are partly moral exemplars because they know how to find that spark in every child. And they may not have tons of money, they may not have tons of experiences or connections, but their commitment and their ability to connect personally with the students and inspire them in spite of these difficult circumstances was something I wanted to emulate. So now let me ask you about this phrase I heard you say. I mean, when I heard you on the James Madison program webinar not long ago, of course I had read your work, and I know Brendan Faraday, who's an alum of the Scala program, is now your PhD student. We've met in person once, but I loved this term that I heard you say, every child has a spark. So can we start there? You know, when we talk about, because so much of your work is on character development or morality, and people tend to think of those as kind of rigid, but I actually think you're saying something different. You're talking about every child has a spark, every child has a purpose, has a vocation, and that may be the basis of character education or moral education. So can you explain to us a little bit about that concept?
Sure. Well, there's both a general and an individual part to the spark. And the general is something that we all share as a species, which is that every child is born with a natural disposition towards empathy. And that's something we've learned from, at this point, decades of research of studying newborns and lots of clever experimentation that I won't get into right now. But we do know that everyone has that potential to care for other people and is born with that emotional sharing of other people's distress or joy or whatever the emotion is. And that's a very powerful moral predisposition. Now, everybody doesn't always develop that in a full way, and that's the role of learning. But that general disposition is part of everybody's moral concern and is part of the moral spark that everyone shares. Beyond that, and this is a very important thing that educators, I think, really need to come to terms with, is that everybody's an individual. Everybody really is a snowflake in a sense, and every child has some special talent or interest or potential that is his or her own. And that's the job of parents and teachers, to help the child develop that. First, by recognizing what it is and allowing the child the space and the freedom to explore it. But once the child begins to express it, giving the child resources and material and encouragement to develop what that is. And a lot of purpose development, the reason purpose is such a powerful and interesting part of life is that purpose, of course, has great meaning for everybody and great benefits to both the person and society. In that sense, it's something everyone shares, but everybody's purpose is special, is their own individual take on life. And the only way children are going to develop that in a complete way is to find their own talents and interests and discover what it is, number one, they love to do, number two, they're capable of doing, something they have some talent at, and number three, something they believe in, something that they see as adding to the world in a powerful way. When a child discovers those three things in their own individual way, the child is ready to develop and commit to a purposeful life.
That's fascinating. And, you know, I find that so interesting because one of the key authors I teach in the Scala program is Jacques Maritain and his book, Education at the Crossroads.
Mm-hmm.
And he wants to remind people that as important as, you know, the social role of the child might be or their, you know, eventual job, the real engine of education is the student himself or herself, because they have this inner spark. And as a teacher, I've certainly experienced that in the classroom. When you tap into that inner spark, the student really livens up. Now, you don't mean this to say that if my inner spark isn't mathematics, I don't study mathematics, or if my inner spark isn't art, I don't study art.
Oh, of course.
You just mean it to say that the student, in the process of learning a whole variety of things, that's part of how they come to know what their greatest talent or what their greatest aspiration is.
Absolutely.
Now,
These are not either or. I'm a big believer in liberal arts, meaning that general education, and it's important that even computer nerds learn to appreciate great artwork, and great artists learn to count and do numbers. So that all of that's important. But in addition to that, everyone deserves a chance to go deep into something that they're special at. And so educators really need to do both, allow people the freedom to go as far as they can in their own area, but also provide them with the general knowledge that enables them to enjoy all of life and function in society.
Right. Now, your background, your own educational graduate degree is in developmental psychology. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
So, but then you've brought the insights of developmental psychology into the field of education, into the practice of education. And so I wonder if you could tell us, I mean, so much of your work has been on character education and moral education, the moral life of the child. In a big picture, kind of why is there relatively little research in the field of education on these, what seem to be very important questions on morality and character? What happened that these questions are no longer central in how we think about what a good education is?
Well, I think they're coming back. I mean, going all the way back into history, the early days of public education in our country were very focused on character and moral insights. The McGuffey readers, which were the main way that kids learned to read all through the 19th century, were full of moral lessons. The 20th century moved away from that and became increasingly specialized as an academic sense, and people became a little threatened about the idea of teaching values to kids. And that's a long story that I won't take the time to go into now. But in recent years, there has been a recognition that we are teaching the whole child here. We're not just teaching logical thinking or academic knowledge of skills, but everything about the child is our responsibility in schools. And even if you tried to avoid it, this was the irony. Let's say, oh, I don't want to deal with values because they're controversial. Well, if you're running a school, you actually have to deal with values because you need to enforce or at least encourage honesty. You don't want kids cheating. You don't want children harming each other. You want them to be orderly. You certainly don't want them to be discriminatory. There's lots of values that all educators do, even if they don't think about it. So what character education is all about is saying, well, let's think about this. And we're going to do values anyway. It goes with the territory of schooling. So let's really think about what the whole child needs and bring in all of the character strengths as part of our educating young people. And that it certainly includes honesty and compassion, fair-mindedness. These are not controversial issues. In fact, the public interest group once did a study of parents just to test this out, and they found that 98% of American parents want their children to learn to be honest, which makes you wonder what the other 2% were thinking. But anyway, 98% is a pretty good consensus of that this is a value that we can agree on and that schools should actually promote.
That's great. Well, then maybe you could tell us, so it's coming back a little bit, the understanding of character education or values as intrinsic to what we do in education. There might have been a time when I read in one of your books, maybe it was The Moral Child, or maybe it was Greater Expectations, where people actually did posit a sort of value-free form of education. That's past now, and we're beginning to talk once again about character, values, morality. So what would you say, kind of, what are some of the, well, first of all, what are some of the big debates in this field, and what are some of the big developments in your eyes? Because I know that once you actually start delving into the science of morality or the psychology of morality, not everybody actually reaches the same conclusions. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about some of these debates about the nature of human morality and how it develops, as well as what are some of the most important findings from recent research, yours or other people.
Well, let me start with schooling itself, especially public schooling, there's one debate that is, or at least uh, conflict that is not so much an ideological debate, but rather a practical debate, which is very simply how much time should be devoted to non academic or non basic skills kinds of education. And this came up a lot in the last 20 years or so when school systems all over the country were encouraged or even almost mandated by the federal government to focus on basic skills at the exclusion of a lot of other kinds of knowledge or interests. And even art and music started getting squeezed out of a lot of schools because there was such a demand to come up with good test scores in very narrow subject matters. And in that context, there were questions raised about whether classroom discussions about character and moral issues were just taking too much time away from learning how to do well on standardized tests. And this, I think, was a misdirection for a lot of reasons, and not just because of the moral and character subject matter, but also because of, as I said, art, music, history, civics, lots of other things that got squeezed out. I think fortunately, we've learned the lesson that that was not a good approach. And the last 3 or 4 years, educators have been moving back to a whole child perspective. So then it gets to the point of, well, what other reservations would there be about moral and character instruction? Well, one of the directions that has been, I think, welcome in moving back again to a whole child perspective has been the SEL approach, the social emotional learning approach, which again is moving into areas of social and emotional development that go beyond simply basic skills. But the debate there is whether or not, as part of social emotional learning and in those areas, whether or not values such as right and wrong should be emphasized. And that's a kind of a classic, and it's a very legitimate debate because you don't want you don't want teachers or anybody to be brainwashing children according to idiosyncratic kinds of beliefs about areas that really are controversial in society. But I get back to what I said earlier, which is that there are some core values of just common decency and civilized living that include honesty, compassion, fair-mindedness, responsibility, respect. These are very basic and I would say universal values. Don't do harm to people that you find all over the world and in every culture. And that those are the values that should be included in the social emotional realm. And I think that to the extent that there's any debate, it has to do with that. And I'm definitely on the side of saying, number one, values that have to do with common decency and responsibility and truthfulness are very much a part of the educator's responsibility. Values that have to do with controversial areas that religion and cultures are divided on and so on have no place in the classroom. So you do need to focus on the common core values of civilizations everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating. You know, you were talking about these debates about the nature of teaching values in the public school context. And so you're
Right.
talking about kind of what's the basis for a common set of values, right? I've also, you know, if I recall
That's right.
correctly, in your book, The Moral Child, you actually make the point, if I understood you correctly, that a lot of what children learn about morality is not learned in a classroom or in a curriculum or in a school. They learn it through real life experiences with their parents, with being involved in a civic group or in a faith group. So it's not that you're saying that some of these controversial issues around which religions and cultures differ aren't considered part of an education more broadly. It's just, do they belong in a public school classroom? Is that right?
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. That was the modifier I should have put in. I was talking about public schools. Of course, religious schools or any faith-based instruction or religious institutions uh, have not only the freedom, they ought to express the values that they believe in, and all of that's fine and welcome. And that is how children learn a lot of their moral sense. But public schools, of course, cut across all forms of culture and religion. And for those, I think that it's important for teachers to focus on the values that are shared. And those are very important. And they're also shared among all religious traditions. Every religious tradition
Right.
cares about um, compassion and fairness and all of the basic core values.
Yeah.
The golden rule is shared among, as far as I know, just about every religion that there is. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
So it sounds like what you're saying is what I think a lot of philosophers or thinkers about the great world religions or philosophy would think. Like there are differences between what people come down on some really important and perhaps very central ultimate questions for some people. It's not that those differences don't exist or aren't consequential, but in spite of those differences, it sounds like you're saying there's a pretty large common basis of universal human morality that we can all draw on. And in a country as diverse and as pluralistic as the United States, we should know what those are and we should be thinking about teaching them. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's been validated by anthropologists or people that study cultural psychology, such as Richard Schwader, who who has a phrase that he uses exactly to get to this point, which he says, there is moral universalism, but not uniformity. In other words, there are cultural variations in all kinds of things, but there are some core beliefs that are necessary for civilizations and that do cut across. And children um, learn these things by going to school, by being in families, by all kinds of instruction. And that is our responsibility as adults to pass on these universal norms and wisdom to the young.
Right. Well, another area that I wanted to ask you to explore on that I think might make you somewhat different than some people in the field of psychology or education that I've seen. For example, in your book, The Power of Ideals, in the beginning of that book, it sounded to me like you were critiquing a bit of a reductionist view of the human person as purely material, or even just purely material and psychological, that there's also a spiritual dimension to the person, which maybe different traditions of faith explain that differently, but it's part of who we are. And it also seemed to me that you were saying that there's important insights on moral questions that we get from our own experience in the world, first person accounts of the world, as well as from the ancient traditions of wisdom coming from philosophy or from religion. Now, that may sound like common sense, but it's a critique of the only way to talk about right and wrong is through an experimental method with lots of points of data. And it sounded to me like you were actually defending a pluralistic way of arriving at the truth, one of which could be collecting data through an experiment, but another could be through studying moral exemplars and studying philosophical and religious traditions, which represent ways of thinking and living that have endured for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yes, well, you've raised a number of good points, and there's both a methodological component and a conceptual component in what you just said. So let me try to separate that. First, let me say that there has been a recent trend in moral psychology, as you said, to be reductionistic, which is to say that a lot of our moral responses, if not all of them, are based on our evolved biological processes. And so we shrink from things that we find disgusting. And the model for that is incest or something like that, but they apply it to every kind of moral choice that people make. And that's one kind of reductionism. And the other, which is kind of the opposite, is to reduce everything to whatever the culture so-called tells us. And so we respond according to what we've been told by whatever the rules of the game are that we've learned. And my view is that neither explains the most important moral choices that people make. What explains the most important choices that people make are the mental processes, the agency that a person has, in a sense, the free will that people have to make choices based on their beliefs and what inspires them. That's why we called one of our books The Power of Ideals, because ideals really do make a difference in what we believe, and they make a difference in what we choose to do in our behavior. And it's not just, our behavior is not just driven by a submerged biological impulse, and it's not just driven by our reading of the cultural scripts. The methodological point that you made that follows from that is that the way we can discover this is by learning about how people who have done the most clearly morally committed behavior in their lives that requires courage and persistence and that really makes a difference in the world, how do these people make their choices? And that's exactly what experiments do not do. The experiments where you put people in a room and see how they'll respond if somebody shocks somebody, or how they answer a hypothetical dilemma, like what happens if a trolley car gets loose and runs over 5 people. These experiments, first of all, are very quick little snapshots of what ordinary people do when given a artificial situation. When we study moral exemplars, we look at extraordinary people, the limits of human potential, who have chosen to spend their lives pursuing noble moral causes, pursuing purposes. And to me, that is a way of finding out what it is that people are capable of doing. And it not only tells you what moral exemplars are capable of doing, it tells you what all of us in our best moments are capable of doing. And that's what we want to learn in studies of moral development. So we don't use these experiments, partly because they don't go very deep into what people actually believe, and partly because they don't sample people who have really spent their lives thinking and doing about these things. And I'll just say one more thing about the experiments, which is that if you take some of the experiments like the Milgram experiment or the Zimbardo one, where people, when they're put in a situation, suddenly do things that look like, oh, gee, people are very insensitive. They'll shock people if a person in a white coat tells them to shock somebody, or if you put them as a prison guard, they'll act horribly to people. A lot of those people, when you speak to them a week later or a couple of weeks later, they think about it and they say, gee, I shouldn't have done that. I've learned to do better.
Right.
And there are also subjects in those experiments that refuse to do that, and those are often not reported because they're unusual. But it's exactly these unusual people that we're interested in, and it's the people that learn that we're interested in. So those are the kind of research methodological paradigms that we use.
Yes. Well, I want to get to both the methodological point, as you put it, as well as this wonderful concept of moral exemplars and the kind of method and that gives rise to. But part of the reason that your critique of the experimental method resonated with me is that although I think research based in experiments can provide certain insights, I personally was actually not surprised when the so-called crisis of replication came out in psychology, because just because the same person walks into a store or a scenario and behaves one way today, they might actually reflect on that and change what they should do the next day, right? So the idea that the way a person behaves in an experimental condition with a snap judgment is representative and predictive of how they're always going to behave always struck me as a really big conjecture, because precisely what you talk about is that, or in fact, maybe it's a theoretical point. If you want to look at people's most deeply held moral commitments, they often reach them through struggle and through reflection and through difficult scenarios. And changing sometimes what they believe or coming to firm up what they believe. And so my point was simply in engaging with some of this research, which was that I don't really, I mean, no matter how many pieces of data you have, no matter how many fMRIs you have, no matter how many surveys you have, no matter how many experiments you have, I have spoken with people, as have you, reflecting on their moral choices and their moral behavior. And they talk about themselves as having freedom in their moral choices, not being determined by the situation. They talk about sometimes revising or fundamentally changing their views or their moral judgments. And they talk about these processes of struggle to form moral commitments and live them out. And I'm simply saying that all of your big data can't answer the questions that a biographical study of a person can lead you to. You are also, I think, humble in your book, and you say that autobiographical self-reflection accounts have their shortcomings, right? We selectively remember things, there might be some missing pieces of the story. But I think the take-home point here is we simply can't discount a developmental perspective, a person's own reflection on their moral commitments, because if we do, we're actually falling into a deterministic viewpoint that what people say is completely irrelevant to what they believe, which is kind of a strange conclusion to reach. So I love this approach that you give of moral exemplars. And I wonder if you could just pick an example of a moral exemplar that you write about in your work to illustrate for our listeners this idea of forming moral commitment and how moral exemplars talk about this process.
Sure. One of the early studies we did in the book Some Do Care profiled a woman named Virginia Durer, who was a woman who grew up in the South in Montgomery, Alabama, and went to then Wellesley College. And she began life with a lot of very kind of traditionally discriminatory attitudes, and learned during her time, especially at Wellesley, to question her own set of assumptions about how society should be structured and race relations. And she became a leader in the civil rights movement through a lot of trial and error. She would try one thing and then learn that, well, I really need to adjust my thinking in this way. And she became one of the most effective leaders during that time, back in the 1960s, when she was in her 90s when we interviewed her, and that was back in the late 80s. So she was an example of somebody that, first of all, learned a lot. And that's one of the unique things about the human moral condition, is that we learn from our mistakes. And that's why the experiments don't give you a sense of that, because they're a snapshot, and human development is a movie, not a snapshot. And part of what enables us to develop is that we have the capacity to learn from our mistakes. And if we have and use the right word, if we have the humility to be willing to question ourselves and to be open-minded. The great Swiss psychologist Fritz Ozer has done a number of studies in the area of what he calls negative morality, which is showing how the most powerful thing in moral learning is when you confront the fact that you've done something wrong and you have the humility to admit it. So that's exactly where I think the study of lives, the study of biographies, can help us understand how this kind of moral change happens. And it happens for all of us. The study of exemplars is not only to study amazing people, it's also to study developmental processes that apply to every one of us, at least potentially, if we have the humility and open-mindedness to be willing to question our own mistakes and learn to do better.
That's a wonderful point, that the study of moral exemplars brings to light developmental processes that all humans undergo. And so what a moral exemplar does, or I call it sometimes with my students, like pick a successful case. Business schools do this a lot, right? Like successful company turns around. What are the processes that happened that led to this outcome? So when you're studying moral exemplars, you're studying like a successful case. And I've also found, I saw this in your syllabi, and I do the same thing. Have students do an interview with a person. Have students actually study a social context over time, and you see how complex it is and how much it changes. And then right away you'll see the experimental method is showing you a snapshot, which might be very important, but it simply can't answer all the questions.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. They're not that we can learn, and we do learn from the experiment. So I don't want to be overly critical, but I think they're just incomplete, and and as you said, and I think it's important to know this, that the methods that we use, which are interviews, case studies, biographical data, are also limited because of exactly what you said, that people uh, people have a certain view of their own life history that isn't 100% veridical. And so we have to recognize that and find ways to compensate for that too. So all research methods in and of themselves are inadequate. And the best way to go about something is to try to combine and triangulate and get different views on the phenomena that you're studying.
Exactly. And there was another point in what you said that I want to probe a little bit on, but let me just say, I'd like to give people a reminder that we're going to be taking questions from the audience. You can use the Q&A button. There's already a couple of questions in there. Please do use the Q&A button for your questions, not the chat. So go to Q&A and type up your questions. We'll get to them in just a moment. But I wanted to circle back to another part of what you said about moral exemplars, that they learn from their failures, and that one of the findings you found again and again is that growth happens when we acknowledge failure and grow in humility and open-mindedness and improve. Now, another one of your books, which I highly recommend, Greater Expectations, begins with I thought, a pretty strident critique of any form of kind of understanding human personality or character, as arguing we just need to educate students by telling them what they're good at. Now, there's a place for that. There's a place for affirmation and self-esteem. But in your book, Greater Expectations, you were making the argument, if I'm correct, that a part of character education and moral development has to be teaching students to understand where they've fallen and helping them to grow from their failures. So can you tell us a little bit more about that book, and why is that today, I would say, a difficult thing to do? I have encountered students who seem to be surprised that teachers are giving them correction. I'm like, so why is that a controversial thing? And why is learning from failure and incorporating that in education so important?
Well, I think the misdirected message that is at the heart of the problem is the idea that self-esteem in and of itself is a value that that as an abstract idea should be just automatically passed along to students. It's very important that students are encouraged and feel that they're valued and that they have all the potential in the world. So in that sense, it's important that teachers and parents communicate a sense of optimism and self-regard among students. But that doesn't mean that students should not be corrected when they make mistakes. In fact, the irony is that when students think that you're giving them just phony praise, everybody's a winner, or we have a contest and everybody won, or there's no such thing as making a mistake, either behaviorally or academically, they discount it. They don't even trust it. That does not build their self-esteem. What builds their self-esteem is the sense that, well, I can do it. I may not have done it this time. I may have made a mistake or failed at this particular thing, but I can get back up on the horse and ride it again. I can do it. that's the message that students need to learn, not the message that anything they do is automatically right. And I think that has been a problem in education because people are confused about what self-esteem is and how children really learn it. And they think it's a general message. It's not a general message. It's a particular message that encourages students to achieve and to try to do better and gives them the confidence that they can, if they keep at it, that they can persevere and succeed. But they need to take it seriously and work at it and correct their mistakes and learn from their failures.
Mhm. Well, could it be that this misconception that we just affirm what's good in students and promote their self-esteem, could it be that that approach is rooted, maybe unintentionally or as an outgrowth of a view of the human person that sees human nature as either a blank slate or positive, and overlooks that most ancient wisdom from philosophy, theology would have posited that human beings inside of themselves have tendencies for good, but also have tendencies for evil. And as you said, moral education was central to education for so long, precisely because people thought it was important for a stable, functioning society to have a system that would, yes, teach us our spark and build up our self esteem, but also actually help people correct their own inner tendency for evil. So, have we lost a little bit of this older conception of the human person as having both good and evil? That's my question.
Well, I'll put it maybe in a way that is that avoids the deeper philosophical issue of good and evil, which I think is probably um, maybe a little deeper cut than educators need to wrestle with. But I do think here's the way I would put it, and I think it's the same spirit of what you're saying, is that discipline is important. And that is part of what educators are responsible to pass on to children. And discipline, both in the sense of disciplined work, that you don't get to be a great anything, a great artist or filmmaker or computer scientist or anything, unless you have the discipline to actually practice and do the hard work of mastering that skill. But also discipline in a behavioral sense that if you do cheat at school, for example, it's not just something that should be dismissed as, well, Johnny was just kind of being cooperative or something like that. It's something that there should be a response, that student has to do the work over again, or a privilege is removed, or something like that, to pass along the message that your behavior was wrong and you need to learn to do better. So discipline is important, and that we're not automatically programmed to always learn to do the right thing without some effort at actually working at it and getting feedback, honest feedback from adults and people who have the responsibility to tell you when you are stepping off track and doing something that needs to be corrected.
Right. So maybe another way of saying it, if I understood you correctly, is that, well, yes, every child has a spark, every child has a talent, but they're not going to be able to reach that potential or develop that talent without structure, maybe
Yeah,
discipline,
exactly.
feedback, guidance. And so part of education has to be educating the student to know how to hear that and how to integrate that. And that's a fundamental role of what teachers and educators should be doing.
Exactly. Well said.
Okay. Well, I want to now go to a couple of questions from the audience. We do have one question from Robin Landreth, who is another alum of the Scala Summer Program, and she's really interested in your example of moral exemplars. And she would like to know, in these moral exemplars who've done extraordinary things, how much of that is attributable to what you call their spark, their individual particular capacities to do something extraordinary? And how do we know how much of it is attributed to the general spark that could be achieved by everyone? So when we look at these moral exemplars, how do we who want to study them? In fact, I have a whole shelf of biography. I recently rearranged my books during COVID, and I put all together all my biographies because I do
Ah,
study moral exemplars, and I think everybody should. If you haven't read a good biography of a moral exemplar recently, read one. But Robin's question is, what in their exemplary action is attributable to them, and what can we take away, even if we're not exactly like them? How do we know what's the universal component of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the actual forms of action that they do, and the causes that they're choosing to commit to are indeed part of their own personal view of the world, and in a sense their spark. They understand something about a problem that needs to be fixed because they themselves have lived it, they've recognized it, they've been interested in it. So whatever the cause is, if it's a health related cause, it may be related to their grandmother dying of cancer, or if it's a environmental cause, it could be, I mean, if you look at Rachel Carson, for example, a wonderful environmental exemplar, she just was in awe of nature. That was who she was, and that went all the way back to when she was a little girl. That was special to her. So I think the particularities of the causes and their own genius at figuring out what to do about it. Rachel Carson was a great writer, for example. So, and she wrote Silent Spring, which is a brilliant book. So that is particular, and that is related to what you would call their spark. The general characteristics that they all share, that we can all learn from, are things like courage and commitment, and both the very special combination of humility and certainty that they show, that we write about in our books about moral exemplars. That's a very inspiring and unusual combination. They're both humble enough to learn, and they often say, well, people call me a leader, but I'm actually learning from people that think of me, think of themselves as my followers. And these people are so open-minded, but they're open-minded in the sense of learning how to pursue goals that they're very certain about. So they never question the goals of compassion or the goals of justice. And they're so certain about those that you cannot deter them from them, even by threatening them or telling them to stop. So they have this wonderful combination of humility and certainty that keeps them on track, but keeps them open-minded in a way to regulate their behavior, that they don't get off track and do something in pursuit of their goals that would actually do more harm than good. And so that's what we can learn from, are these qualities of humility, certainty, of justice, compassion, the general qualities that all of us, I think, can pursue.
So although the particular circumstances of their lives might be unique to them or their particular talents, we
Yes.
learn about the virtues, tradition, the courage, humility, open-mindedness, and then I would say through studying these lives with our friends or in a school context, we can then think about how to apply them in our own lives and learn.
Exactly.
We, as you say in your books, we learn morality not just through a curriculum, but through our own life experiences. And I would say studying moral exemplars or being around them is a way of learning from other people's life experiences, the values, the virtues that we want to emulate. We are beings who emulate. We emulate good things, we emulate bad things, I would say.
This is true.
Okay, another question from a listener named Araceli. She is actually my sister-in-law, and she's asking on this cognitive psychology and that she learned, going back to the point we made about experiments being limited in their explanations. These experiments are often presented as having these findings. So like, for example, the Zimbardo experiments where people are blind followers of authority. Do you believe that these studies have actually demonstrated this? And if not, how do we understand, how do we make sense of what the experiments did? Now, as she agrees with you that the time frames are short and the participants knew it was a controlled environment, but then how do we, who are always reading about these experiments, how do we think about what an alternative explanation is if it's not what's being presented by the researchers?
Yeah, well, first let me say that we have learned things from the experiments. If you take Phil Zimbardo's study, as you just mentioned, we've learned that people are capable of this kind of behavior, which is behavior that can be cruel and authoritarian. And it's important to know that human nature has those tendencies, and certain contexts, that was really his point, certain contexts bring that out in people. And so we have to be careful. We've learned to be careful of those contexts and watch out for how people behave when they're in those contexts. The part that we haven't learned from the experiment itself is that people are capable of other things too, including refusing to behave that way, including learning from that behavior and learning to do better, learning that, oh my God, I did this, I can't believe I did this. And even the people that do the experiments, in, well, Phil Zimbardo's case, who's a very brilliant, broad-minded psychologist, he's created his own program now called the Heroic Imagination that recognizes the capacity of people to rise above these tendencies and learn to do amazing things. So I would say Phil Zimbardo himself learned from his experiments and learned that people are capable of more than his initial experiment showed. So that's the part that I think that we have to be aware. We have to be aware, first of all, of the truth that the experiments do convey, and then also the limitations and the truths that they don't get to through that method.
Well, one of the things I appreciate so much about your writing, Bill, is that in all of your books and all of your articles, which I recommend people read, the point you make over and over is that all of these different studies, of course, they are showing us something, but often when this work gets translated into public discourse or educational policy, people make very simplistic assumptions about how these findings will apply in a whole variety of contexts, and then they're not often doing the nuancing work that the scholars themselves are quite often doing, as
Yeah,
you
that's true.
recognize. So again, I would encourage people to try to read some of the primary research, to listen to what the scholars are saying. As you said, under certain conditions, people behave in extreme ways. It doesn't mean they always behave that way, and it doesn't mean that they can't learn to not behave that way. So the findings are just quite simply limited to certain kinds of experimental conditions.
And I think the point you just made gets to the media coverage too. When the popular media cover these dramatic results, they simplify, and so sometimes the experimenters themselves have a fuller picture than you get on that little quick 30-second NPR coverage of it. So you have to be careful.
Studies show 2 words,
Right.
and it becomes a fact. I love to teach this book by Joel Best on statistics, and he has this, well, anyway, so I address this in some of my classes, as do you, and it's an extremely important question to take these studies seriously, but I think I'm trying to point people to other forms of knowledge and to not assume because it's an experiment that it has a hold on knowledge, whereas other forms simply are purely anecdotes or just stories, right? Every approach has contributions and has limitations.
Oh, right, and there's a serious methodology involved in these other approaches. Non-experimental approaches also have very structured, rigorous methodological characteristics too. So qualitative research is not just anecdotes.
That's correct. And I teach qualitative research methods, as do you, and I love to have people do it because they discover it's actually really hard too.
Right, exactly.
It's hard to have a good interview. It's hard to do good ethnographic observation. So all that to say, okay, now we have a question coming from Daryl DiMarzio, who is a professor of education and philosophy. And he wants to know, getting back to what you said earlier, that you are a believer in the liberal arts model of education. And he's asking whether you believe that specifically humanities and liberal arts need to be reoriented toward the kind of moral education you're describing. So should we be reading, for example, he says, Plato's dialogues with an eye towards actually understanding what Plato's philosophical doctrines were, and above and beyond looking at Socrates as a moral exemplar, right? So are there models for a kind of moral education through moral exemplars, like studying Plutarch and his lives as an exemplar in this respect? So those are, I think, really 2 questions. Like, Does the liberal
Well,
arts and humanities have to go back to these moral questions? And are there some moral exemplars we should be holding up from that?
yeah, well, my answer would be yes. I think that's an important point. I'm glad that he made it. Uh, that again, classically, that was the center of the liberal arts tradition, all the way back to John Cardinal Newman, who was maybe the first person to write systematically about that back in the 19th century, about what became the liberal tradition in education. And it was very centered on the moral uh, dilemmas that people face and choices. And I think, as with a lot of things, and it relates to the character education discussion we had before, academia drifted away from that in the 20th century as it became more specialized and more kind of hidebound in terms of disciplines. And that's part of the reason I think students kind of have lost interest in some of the humanities, because it isn't being taught that way. And so, yes, my answer to that is definitely we should recapture the central human dramas that the humanities at its best and the great works of art deal with, and discuss those in the classroom. And those central dramas tend to have moral components. That's what they are. And there are ways that places have done this. There are colleges that are trying hard to do this, and in very interesting ways. There are some colleges I read recently that have done, of course, this is pre-pandemic, but put on campus-wide trials of Socrates, things like that, where you get people playing different roles and having very much these kind of moral debates. And so I think there are people that are aware of this and are trying to move things in that direction. And hopefully that will go on more.
That's a great answer. And to build on what you just said, another question coming in from the audience that echoes one of my questions. If there's anything about the American educational system, is that American educational systems are extremely diverse. We have public schooling, we have private schooling, we have religious schooling, most of which is privately funded. We now have homeschooling. Higher education, we have community colleges, we have liberal arts schools, we have research universities, we have state schools. Now, oftentimes when you start talking about liberal arts, people think that liberal arts is a subset of schooling that's only for a certain kind of person, or in particular, maybe someone who doesn't have to worry about getting a job. So, to put it bluntly, right? And so I think I want to tie this concern into Brendan Faraday's question. Like, when you start talking about the topics we've talked about today, Brendan is specifically asking about your research on purpose. And an argument could be made that to sit around and think about purpose is something that is already a luxury for the privileged. And I've heard that kind of argument being made, not just about purpose, but about studying Socrates or Plato. That studying the liberal arts tradition is something for the privileged, and having these moral discussions is something for the elite. But at the same time, a lot of people want to go into education precisely to work with people very different from themselves and share with them, as you have said so eloquently, universal ideas about the internal spark we have and the nature of the human person and freedom. So there must be something universal about these values if that can transcend context. So how does one, this is my big question for you, right? How does one hold to these universal values while also paying attention to the particularities of the context, racial, economic, geographical, cultural, that one's bringing these ideas into?
Well, that again is a very good and deep question. Let me start with the purpose part of it, then I'll move on to the liberal arts part of it. In all of our studies of purpose, at all ages, from the adolescent years to the early adult years, up through the 50 to 90 population that we studied recently in our study of purpose in the, quote, encore years of life, we find no differences that are driven by, that are related to socioeconomic or ethnicity or anything like that. The purpose is distributed equally across all the different marker categories of our population. And it's it's easy to see why, because purpose provides the same benefits for everybody. And it doesn't matter where you are in the social economic ladder or what your background is. A purposeful life brings with it the benefits of resilience and energy and motivation and meaning and all of the other things. And people everywhere recognize that and search for purpose. And to the extent they find it, it's not determined by anything to do with socioeconomic background or anything like that. So that is a universal human capacity that is available to children everywhere. And how to teach it to different groups of children, I think that is going to be somewhat particular, but I wouldn't want to make any generalizations based on categories of people. I really think it's an individual pursuit of individual children, and it doesn't matter where they're from. Every child has to find their own spark and their own meaning in life. And I don't think these things follow group consciousness in any kind of way, or should. We shouldn't stereotype people. As far as liberal arts goes, the point you made is something that people have worried about, because traditionally in the United States, liberal arts colleges have been elite kind of institutions. But I believe that a broad education in the humanities and other areas, history and everything, is part of our right to have as citizens. And so certainly all the way up through high school, when people are going through public schooling, there needs to be this broad education. The trend towards a narrow, limited education, which focused on basic skills, was a misdirection. High school kids should learn something about literature and music and theater and all of the other riches of life. And in the colleges, one of our studies is looking across section of all American higher education, including community colleges. And community colleges, too, play a very important role in making available to that very non-elite part of the population the richness of the liberal arts and humanities. So I think that it's a mistake to think that this is something that's limited to people of privilege. And just one further thing is that there have been lots of economic studies of liberal arts majors or people with liberal arts backgrounds that show that, if anything, they do at least as well, if not better, in terms of salary and every other thing. So it's not a waste of time for this. Promotes learning how to write well and express yourself, and abilities that are valuable in any trade or skill or career or vocation that you would choose. So I think liberal learning is an important emphasis for every child, every student.
Well, thank you. We only have time for maybe perhaps one more question from the audience. I'm sorry we're not going to get to everyone's questions today, but let me just recap, because I sort of threw two questions at you together. When you responded to Brendan's question about purpose, I just wanted to highlight that what you said was so important, that when you begin to talk about purpose or the spark every student has, that simply cannot be reduced to a group consciousness or a group phenomenon. And oftentimes in education, there's a tendency to want to talk about people from this background or that, or this group or that group. And that may have something to tell you, but it can't possibly tell you everything about the person. And it may not tell you the most important thing. And so the idea that purpose is somehow only something for people who have a luxury of time to think about it is actually perhaps a dangerous idea, because it's undermining every child's ability to find his or her own vocation, which is the
and purpose can be very ordinary too. It doesn't have to be something fancy or noble. You have a purpose when you want to raise your children and you care about them and you want to raise them well. That's an ordinary purpose that people everywhere have. So purpose does not have to be something intellectual or high status or anything like that. Every vocation has a purpose. Everyone.
Your life too, right? That's
Exactly.
what you're willing to give, what you're willing to transcend yourself for, perhaps is another way you've put it, I believe, right?
Right. And anybody that takes pride in their work, no matter what the work is showing purpose.
Now, and then what you said about the liberal arts, I would also just affirm that the liberal arts model of education, of course, it's going to look different in a community college or in a rural school, but to completely take it off, right, to take off the core curriculum entirely from
Right.
education is going too far. So that's why we should have different institution types, but all of them, as you said, should expose students to something of the liberal arts. If not, then we've gone too far. Now, last question, and I want to kind of tie it up with like a wrap-up question. We have a question from Hannah Czar, also an alum of the Scala summer program. We live in a pluralistic society that's also relativistic about some of these moral questions. By that, I think what she means is that some people think there is no truth to some of these
Right.
answers.
Right.
But then, how then do we also uphold that there actually is an unchanging, unified tradition of values, while a lot of people, I would say, speak as if there isn't? And then how do you ultimately defend those kind of universal values without reference to religion? Those are her questions, small questions.
Yeah, right. I mean, some of these questions are so powerful and deep that I'm afraid I don't have ultimate answers to them. I mean, I think it is a matter of faith to some extent that if you believe in truth, it seems to me so self-evident that looking at human life in general, that what would a relationship be like if you couldn't trust the other person to tell you the truth? And of course, it would break down right away. You couldn't even communicate with them in any regular way. So to me, these values kind of speak for themselves, but I recognize that's not a very sophisticated philosophical answer. Fortunately, I'm a psychologist, so I don't have to take responsibility for my lack of philosophical training. But I do think that whether you call it religious or other kind of faith, that you have faith in certain parts of the human situation, and faith that you should value people's lives, you should be compassionate, you should be fair. These values seem to me to be so evidently important for any kind of decent life. So I get back to the idea of common decency. It's a bit of a common sense approach, I have to say, not highly sophisticated in a philosophical way.
Right. Well, I would just say, Bill, I'm also trained in psychology and sociology. That's what my degrees are in. Though now I teach in a program of practical theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. In Scala, I teach on education, and so I teach a lot of philosophy. But when I'm asked these deep philosophical or theological questions, in some ways, the gaps in my knowledge come out because I've not systematically studied the body of philosophy and theology that I want to draw on for my work. Because like you, I think the questions I care about require more than what I got in psychology and sociology.
I'm sure that's right. Yeah, I'm sure that's
You may not have a PhD in philosophy, but in reading your work, it's a field you take seriously and you look towards for some guidance, I believe.
And I try my best to understand it and represent it, but I do have to have my due share of humility about it.
Understood. I feel the same way. And I would just add to Hannah that, what I do is sort of, a relativism, an absolute relativism about morality, as you pointed out, Bill, undermines truthfulness, cooperation, compassion. So in practice, people can't be relativists without becoming a very self-centered nihilist that you wouldn't want to have as a neighbor or a classmate or anything like that. People behave as if we are all subjected to some kind of universal moral force.
That's right.
And I think where religion comes in is in positing an answer, what is that force? So I think human experience and the need to live together teaches us that, hey, there are universal truths. And it's the job of religion to then pose this very serious question, well, if that's true, what's the origin of that? Or is there an origin?
Sure.
And I'm just trying to distinguish what we can learn from experience as humans, which is I think what you're pointing to. There must be some of these truths.
Yeah.
And then the serious study of the origin of those truths, we should take those traditions seriously that have thought hard about that question. And in a pluralistic society, I would like us to see more opportunities to ask, well, how have the major world religions and philosophical traditions answered these questions? Rather than saying, oh, because not everybody reaches the same answer, let's not talk about it at all,
Yeah.
which is the
Agreed.
default I've seen so often. Let's not talk about it because not everybody agrees. Why not?
Agreed.
So I just want to end saying that I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions. We have a few really important questions here about great books lists for high schoolers. I would point you to some of the classical academies like Great Hearts Academy, something like that. We have questions about the current context and about attempts to introduce things into the curriculum that are responding to our current political context. I'm sorry we don't quite have the time to go there, but hopefully there'll be other opportunities to address those kinds of questions. But the reality is we are living in a really difficult time for a lot of people in a lot of ways. And I've chosen to focus this webinar less on kind of how are we going to solve the problems at hand, not because I don't care about those problems, but because I think that the way to solve the problems at hand is to take a step back and think about what have we learned in research on character and morality in the last few decades, which is what you're an expert on, and to allow you the chance to talk about moral exemplars, because I think what we need in difficult times is hope. And hope often comes from looking at somebody who has led a courageous life and learning from them. So I see hope in the movement to reground education, as you said, on character development, morality, these philosophical questions. I have met moral exemplars who are teachers in very difficult urban contexts, in rural contexts, in low-income contexts, and I am so moved by these teachers, administrators in public schools, private schools, homeschoolers who are passionate about the truth. And I wanted to bring to them your research and your knowledge to help them, because as you yourself have said, education and moral development is a lifelong phenomenon. So anybody listening to this at any stage in education or development, the hopeful message is that I think what COVID has taught me is how many amazing online resources there are to further your education. So in that vein, let me thank you once again, Bill, for your time. I think this is probably your third or fourth Zoom call today, and you have others. I'm so passionate about sharing with others all the knowledge that you have produced and your wonderful books. It's very central to Scala's mission, which is, as you put it, educating the whole person, mind, body, and soul. And that includes being serious about the content of the curriculum, the liberal arts dimension, and it includes being willing to discuss these very important questions about the nature of morality and how we grow and who we are as human persons. So,
Thank you, Margarita. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
and I will also just say that I think if people read your books, they will also see that there's a lot at stake in this. There's a lot at stake in how we educate. How we educate people has tremendous impacts on society. So please keep up your great work. I want to thank once again you, the Stanford Center on Adolescence, for co-sponsoring this, the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. And I want to encourage all listeners to subscribe to Scala's YouTube channel so you can listen to this video, share it, and share the highlight clips we're going to produce. And also just sign up for Scala's newsletter so you stay in touch. Scala really wants to become a movement of educators who care about these fundamental questions of the philosophy of the human person and morality and character and education, and bring that to all of these different contexts. So thank you again for your time, Bill. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you to Stanford and Pepperdine for co-sponsoring this. And please stay in touch with us. We're hoping to publish these webinars as an edited volume with additional resources. So you'll be hearing from us about that. Thank you again. Bye-bye now.
Bye.